If you feel like you need to do some sort of pivot because you are feeling stuck in your life, you feel like nothing is working no matter how hard you try, your industry has completely changed, we are going to dive into what the data and the most successful people's stories tell us. And that's what this episode is about: how to pivot properly. So I got this text from a friend after he watched one of our videos, which was about the success loop. And if you haven't seen that video, it's basically the pattern that we've noticed the most successful people do on repeat over and over again. Basically, it's you take action, fail, and pivot. And you do that cycle over and over again until you reach success. With his blessing, I actually want to share what he said. I think the biggest thing I'd want to know is, what do you do when you don't know where to pivot to or how to? What do you do if you feel lost after the fail? The transition between fail and pivot is the hardest for me. And what direction would be the right direction or the wrong one for still trying to get to your dream? How do you make sure you are still going in the right direction as well? We've identified 5 different kinds of pivots that show up again and again across successful people's stories. And once you start noticing them, you will see that most people who break through use at least one of these. But I do think it's important to know what the pivots are before you make a decision on which one's right for you. My hope is that by the end of this episode, you'll walk away with a tangible step and at least something to explore, because being stuck isn't the end of the road. It's not the destination. It's usually a signal that you're approaching a turning point, that something exciting actually might be around the corner if you pivot intentionally. And so with that, welcome to the Anatomy of a Dream. All right, so let's start with the types of pivots that you can make. Right now, the goal is to identify which kind of pivot is going to be best for you. But before we go into the types of pivots, I do think it's important to define what a pivot is, just in case. A pivot is ultimately a change in strategy to better move toward the same dream. Now, I do think it's important to identify if you even need to pivot. And so to me, the clearest sign that you need to pivot is ultimately, 1, you have no momentum, meaning there's no increase in opportunities, in revenue, in relationships or audience, whatever it may be. Number 2 is that there's diminishing returns, meaning you're working harder, but you're actually seeing less and less payoff from it. And number 3 is that there's new information, which basically means that you've learned something that changes how you see your dream or the market that you're playing in. So a very good example is Hollywood right now, right? I'm a director, and I feel like the industry that I entered, it is very different than the industry that exists today, right? So that is new information that does require many people, if not every single person in the industry, to pivot in some capacity. All right, so let's get into the types of pivots. So the first kind of pivot is called a role pivot. Basically, it's I'm in the right world, but in the wrong chair. For those of you that are like, this sounds exciting and great, amazing, that might be the exact path that you need, right? But I do think that a lot of times it sounds a lot scarier to think that you would be in a new role or capacity, and it might seem like everything you've been done prior was a waste. And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case, right? So how do you know this is the kind of pivot that applies to you? Well, first, you might feel like you've hit some sort of ceiling, right? So you're feeling that, well, I can't really grow further than this, and I'm going to be stuck in the same exact spot in 5 years from now, and that does not sound fun. Number 2 is that the work doesn't energize you. Ultimately, you can do the work, but you really don't want to keep doing it. And number 3 is that you want more ownership. You want to be in charge. You want to have a little bit more control over what you're doing. I think a really good example of this that I saw is within my husband. My husband, literally, I met him in film school. He was an aspiring director at the time, and now he's the CEO of our company. And for him, I think that a huge part of it is that he really liked to have the autonomy and having the control over what he was doing with his life. And he wanted to be at the driver's seat of making those decisions. And so he realized that being a CEO was a lot more in alignment with what he wanted to do with his life. And so that pivot in that position, in that role, wasn't necessarily quitting. It was just shifting in the right direction. I think that this is a very natural pivot for a lot of successful people. I think most of them very early on in their journey tend to try out different roles. And that is not ever a waste of time. That is always going to be relevant to your journey now. Why is that? Well, we interviewed Lamar Richardson, who is a 2-time Tony Award winning producer. And he started off in finance and business and psychology. All of these things became very, very useful for him when he entered the producing role. So all that to say, if you're in a place where you feel like you've hit a ceiling, you feel that you are not excited about the work that you're doing, or you feel that you want a little bit more control over your life, this probably is the right pivot for you. Now, this next pivot is a very weird one. And I know it's weird because when I pitched it to my friend, she was like, oh, I'm surprised that you even listed that as a pivot. And it's an environment pivot. So for me personally, I worked from home up until last year. We invested in getting a studio for our company and an office for our company, which, by the way, felt like a huge risk at the time, okay? Now, the reason that we did this is because we understood that if we really wanted to level up to that next level, if we really were serious about making content, we had to change our environment. We had to change the circumstance to a capacity that we knew that we were going to level up naturally in order to meet it. For some of you, this might mean moving cities. For some of you, this might mean joining some sort of club or some sort of environment that's going to inspire you with the right people and give you the right network. And for other people, it might mean investing in an environment that's going to force you to level up to become the person that you need to be in order for that business or that idea to succeed. What's crazy about human beings that I have learned from this so far is that we are incredibly adaptable. But sometimes we have to force the adaptation because we tend to only grow to the level of our surroundings. And we know that. I don't think I'm saying anything new here. And I do think this is a very important pivot because a lot of people, they spend time trying to change everything about how they're doing things, but they're not changing where they're doing things. And that being said, let's move on to the domain pivot. Now, the domain pivot is my skills are right, but the industry is wrong. So one of the greatest examples that I actually learned about through the research of this is Slack. Now, if you don't know what Slack is, it's basically this messaging tool. A lot of companies use it. Our company uses it. And it actually started off as an online game. But the thing is that this game was not gaining any traction. So when the game failed, they noticed something interesting. The only thing that everyone actually loved and used every day wasn't the game, it was the internal messaging tool. Their team had created this little internal chat tool to communicate faster. It wasn't anything fancy, but they needed something that was going to make their communication a little bit easier. And so they realized that the thing they built by accident actually solved a real pain point, and the teams needed a fast, organized way to communicate. And so they pivoted from building a game to building a workplace messaging platform. And that product obviously became Slack. And today, Slack is a multi-billion-dollar company, which was built from the failed game's internal tool. If you are not a company, the way that this applies to you is that this might actually look like changing industries. Now, the domain pivot is my skills are right, but the industry is wrong. And so look at it this way. You have the same core skills here, right? It's the same skills, but you are applying it to a new industry or a new audience. You're taking what you can already do and you're taking it somewhere where it's more valued. Now, for a lot of people, this is actually the hardest one, believe it or not, because they get very precious about their dreams. They get so precious about it that they believe that it has to be in this way, in this format, in this domain, and understanding that if you, at the end of the day, your core dream is to tell stories, for example, and you are a filmmaker, you can tell them for film, you can tell them for TV, and you can tell them on YouTube. But I can't tell you how many filmmakers that I personally know that will only be stubborn to telling it in one specific domain. And that goes for business people as well. They get very precious about their product as opposed to understanding that it might just not be catered to the right audience and into the right industry. All right, so the next pivot is a value prop pivot. And so this basically, in business terms, is it's the same user, but you have a new problem to solve. So ultimately, this means that the thing that your audience or your customer wants from you is going to change. So you stop selling them what you thought mattered, and you start selling them what they're actually buying. Because it's not about changing the product, it's about changing the promise. And when you do that, you start to realize that people aren't paying for this, they're paying for that. And that's where you change the value proposition. I've talked on this channel a lot about pain points and how the most effective way to be in any form of business, I do not care if it's a business or if you are an individual and an artist, but the easiest way for you to be successful in whatever it is that you're doing, is to shift it towards a very strong pain point. And so what I've noticed from all of this research is that not only does it confirm it, that these very successful people have pivoted towards very large pain points, is that they understood what the customer was feeling pain about. We actually had to do this with one of our companies, Bizly. It's a home for creatives work. I always say that there is the show your work people and the tell your work people. The tell your work people, the people who have resumes that you just read, they belong on LinkedIn. The show your work people, the people who have to show their work in order to get hired, they belong on Bizly. But what we realized is that in order for this app to actually work, you're going to need to first foremost create the network. So what were we offering those people other than a future promise, right? That was the problem we were facing. And that's the biggest thing that most networks face. So we realized what we had to shift was the value proposition. And this became a 2-year investment, which, by the way, we are fully self-funded. And we started from scratch. And it's not that we don't have the same objective of one day it becoming a network where it could become easy for us to hire people, which we, by the way, still use it as that because we still have people on there and we hire them all the time. But we realized that we had to offer them something else. So what we offered them is a place that is as easy to upload your work as any social platform, but it looks as good as a very beautiful custom website. And this is where we had to let go of our vision of what we wanted to sell and say at the beginning in order to really meet the customer with where their pain point was. And so if you were currently in a place where you're realizing that your customer is just not responding to what you are offering, if it almost feels like they just don't need what you believe they need, and they're just not seeing the point, as opposed to trying to convince them, why don't you listen to what it is that they're actually struggling with and shift your product or your service towards that? Which brings me to our next pivot, which is the method pivot. This is basically my dream is right, but my strategy isn't. You've probably seen this Group 7 girl, Sophia James, popping on your feed recently. And if not, here's a quick version of it. About a week ago, Sophia James was literally another very, very talented, aspiring singer trying to catch a break online, okay? And she had been posting online for years. Like when you really look at everything she was posting before, she was doing everything right. But the thing is, it wasn't working. And then one night, apparently she started feeling discouraged. And honestly, I don't even understand how she even came to this idea, but it was brilliant. But she decided to try something different. Here's a clip of what she did.
If you're watching this video, you are in Group 7. I've posted 7 videos tonight, and this is the 7th one. Just as a little science experiment to see what kind of video gets the most reach out of the 7. And I don't know what that says about you, but you're in Group 7. Welcome.
And that video, it blew up. It did more for her overnight than years of content ever did. And since then, James's video has soared past 80 million views. There are close to 800,000 videos using that Group 7 hashtag. And Sophia is almost now at 1 million subscribers. And what's crazy is that it's basically the same product. It's still her song in the background of that video. She's still promoting the same thing, but she just had new packaging for it, right? This is the core of this method pivot, okay? Because she unintentionally repackaged her song as Group 7 as an inside joke instead of, hey, listen to my single, right? It was a different strategy. You're just changing the way that you're going about things. Before we get back to the episode, Oscar does have one more request. Why don't you let him know? Tell him. All right, he's a little shy. He's asking if you can check down below and make sure that you are subscribed to our channel. Doing so helps us so much. It helps us bring on great guests and helps us get the answer to the anatomy of a dream once and for all. Okay, I'll put you down. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the video. Now we're just gonna go by breaking down my friend's questions, and we're gonna basically do the anatomy of his question, okay? So the first question is, what do you do if you don't know where to pivot to or how to? There are a few steps that I have realized have really worked for me. Define the dream behind the dream. Now, it sounds like what it is, but I do think there's a lot here that we need to break down, okay? So often we get so caught up in the core premise, the core title of what our dream is. So for me, for well over a decade, my dream has been to be a director. I, in a lot of ways, am living that dream. However, about a year ago, I was having a bit of an existential crisis. I had just wrapped this very big project for Amazon that I was directing. And ultimately, I had two options. I had the option of going to pursue my feature film, or I had the option of focusing my time and venturing off in a new domain. By no means was I failing as a director, but I saw that the industry was changing. There are less projects being made now than there were in COVID. And so, as opposed to being scared by this fact, I understood that if I really wanted to create content or stories that were really important to me, I may have to consider doing that in a different domain. I realized that I had to get clear on the dream behind the dream. Because if I got really, really set on, I want to be this kind of director who directs these kinds of films, well, what good is that if, currently speaking, no one's buying these projects and no one's watching them? So then I had to get clear on, what is it about directing that I actually love? Why is that my dream? And then I started listing things out. I realized that I love storytelling. I loved collaborating with people. And more than anything, I loved bringing out the best in them. When I looked at my list and I saw that I had written down, I want to help people, I realized that I could do that through my feature film that I had written. And I could spend the next 5 years trying to make that happen. But I could also do it with hundreds of videos that I would film within the next 5 years. And that if I was really that committed to helping people, I would probably have a much easier time doing that on YouTube. And I think in that moment is where I would ask you to keep in mind when you're looking at all the pivots, out of all of these pivots, which one is the highest leverage, meaning for the least amount of work, I'm going to get the most output of getting most of these things done? Which one checks out most of them, if not all of them? This brings me to the next step, which is to find your areas of flow. Here's what you need to ask yourself. What do I enjoy so much that I lose track of time anytime I do it? Where do I naturally perform well? And third, what do people come to me for? By the way, it does not have to be only things that are relevant to your career or to your business, okay? I would ask that this is an opportunity for you to write everything and anything that you just enjoyed doing. Things that you literally are like, I low-key don't want this to end. And B, I could do this all the time. When I was talking to a friend yesterday, I was talking to her about this, and immediately what's really interesting is she began talking about what she didn't want. She talked about what she loved and what she really enjoyed, but then she was saying, but not in this context. And I find it really interesting because I did the same thing. When I talked about things that I loved, right? Like I love teaching people. I loved speaking to students, but I don't want to do it on social media. I don't like social media. I don't want to be an influencer. And I just kept saying that. And the funny thing is, she was saying the same thing. And so when it comes to areas of flow, just make sure that you are not writing exceptions to the rule. Just only focus on what it is that you enjoy. Because I think that the biggest mistake that we can do is limit ourselves with our preconceived judgments on the different routes we could take. That is not the moment to do that here. And so for me, I realized that I loved teaching. I was obsessed. My hobby was self-development and learning from other successful individuals. I was listening to Kobe Bryant, even though I have no interest in basketball. I loved learning from Kobe Bryant and other athletes on how they built their success and their discipline within their domains. I would do that for fun. I also wrote down that I had a weird obsession with analytics. I really loved analyzing. And so when I wrote all of those things down, all of the areas of flow that I really had a lot of passion for, the one that really stuck out to me was that I really loved teaching and I really loved talking about dreams. And when I realized that the word dream was the thing that I have been obsessed with since I was a little girl, I'm telling you, like I have notebooks filled with things that talk about my dreams as a kid. I loved obsessing over that. When I identified that this was my area of flow, this was an added layer of information that I really didn't have before because I was so stuck on the director package. This brings us to step number 3, which is to look at what has worked. Now, if you have been at this for a bit, it's worth taking inventory of all the things that actually created momentum in your life, okay? Now, even if it's small wins, and look at this as a proper audit. Okay, so look at every single time that you have either had financial success, every single time that you have had creative success, whatever it may be. It doesn't only have to be in this business necessarily. But of course, I would argue that, if you really want to improve the mechanics or the aspects of your business that are not working, I would definitely obviously go deep in there. On our end, we looked at, the 3 videos on our channel that performed the best. And funnily enough, they were all about business. And so we took note of that. Failure gives us a lot of information. I would argue failure gives you more information than not. But also there is information in your successes. Now there's information for you that's relevant because it obviously shows you that you have the capacity of being successful. And I think that's a really important reminder that I personally never do. And so this is for me. We have to do a better job at reminding ourselves that we are capable of success. But number 2, I think it also shows us on what we should double down on. This brings me to the 4th step. And it actually answers our next question, which is, what direction would be the right direction or the wrong one for still trying to get your dream? Now, of course, I think that the basic answer is that there is no wrong or right answer, right? But I wanted to make sure that within every single question, we were looking at data. We were looking at the people who had reached crazy levels of success. And I really tried to look at all the stories where people where they had definitely faced their own version of the dark night of the soul, okay? And what it came down to, I think, is this question of what could you do 1,825 times? Where did this fucking number come from? Well, it normally takes startups 1 to 5 years to become profitable. What we basically took was 365 days, and I multiplied it by 5. So if the direction you choose, you could do every single day for 365 days of the year for 5 years, it is the right direction. Think about it this way. The person who likes doing the thing will always beat the person who's just disciplined enough to do it. Because they're going to do more reps because they love it. And I think we have this obsession with discipline and that being the answer to success. But what I have seen is that, yes, successful people, they are obviously very disciplined, but they're also very passionate about what they're doing. And you look at people like Mr. Beast, who just is obsessed. He loves what he does, right? And he makes so much content. He makes an ungodly amount of content. And tell me that he would do that same thing if he didn't love it. Like, there is just no amount of discipline that would get him to do it for this long, this often. At this point, he would have just, started dwindling down and not make it. He doesn't have to make this much content. He's already made it. But he continues to do it because he loves it so much. For me, a lot of what we researched in this video helped us make the pivot that I believe will probably help us get to that next stage in this whole journey. If you've been watching for the past 6 months, you've probably noticed that we have been experimenting with different formats and different styles. I felt a lot of stress for whatever reason. I don't know why. I felt like what was going to work were these business listicle videos, okay? That was where we were caught between. But I knew that I didn't want to make them. And so while I felt like, okay, look, I know that if I double down on these videos, that work, because that's the caveat to figuring out what works. You can figure out what works. Take a portion of it if it's relevant, but take out the portion that you can't sustain. Because at the end of the day, it's almost useful. That's the wrong direction. You want to think about long term. And so for me, I knew that while I would probably see a lot more success up front from making those listicle business videos that had high production and would showcase our editing skills and what we could do, I knew that the thing I really wanted to do was interview people. I wanted to interview other people and learn from them. I wanted the longer format because, well, I talk a lot and it's very exhausting to consolidate my thoughts to 14 minutes. I wasn't sustainably going to be able to do that 1,825 times. And so I keep asking myself that question. If this pivot works and I reach the ultimate levels of success through this pivot, could I do 1,000 of them? Could I do 2,000 of them? Could I do this every single day and not get tired? And if the answer is yes, I would not get tired, then that is the right direction. I think we normally look at the right direction as a result, as opposed to the right direction being something that we enjoy. And there is no point to reach a destination if you have built yourself a golden cage. That is, I can't imagine anything worse, honestly. So that brings us to our final question of my friend's text, which is, what do you do if you feel lost after failure? I think the important thing to understand is that failure really is the only form of feedback that matters. And what's crazy about success is that it hides your mistakes and failure exposes them. And so tell me what's more useful. When we look at the most successful people, the thing about them is that they didn't take failure personally. They treated it as information. It wasn't I suck or this sucks or I'm unlucky, but it was, all right, that approach sucked. Good to know. These individuals were not professional inventors or CEOs. They were professional failures. And I would argue that all successful people still are professional failures because that is what keeps them at the top. And so I think it's nice to think of ourselves that we're in good company if we're failing. So when we're looking at the anatomy of a dream, specifically when it comes to if you're in a place where you're feeling stuck and you're feeling like everything that you have done is not working, because trust me, I feel that on a daily level. But I have to constantly remind myself that turning a fail into a pivot, it's not a leap. It's a bridge made of experiments. So don't look for one decision. I think when we look for one decision, we actually shoot ourselves in the foot. Don't look at the pivot as a new dream, but look at the pivot as a new strategy toward the same dream. And so I think that in that moment of feeling lost after failure, for some reason we take it so personally and we think that it's a reflection of us or that it's some sort of indication that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. I know that that's the hardest part. For me, it's the hardest part. Because I think that we'll post a video that doesn't work and somehow, even though while we're posting it, I know that I'm like, it's okay if it doesn't work. But somehow the failure still hurts. It still hurts that we're not moving in the direction that we want to fast enough. But then I have to remind myself, well, what good does it do me if this video succeeds and I don't even understand really what I did to get there in the first place? What good does it do for me if I'm really here to help people if I don't go through the bullshit myself? And so I think that what we do after failure is we pivot. And understanding that feeling lost isn't an indication that you are not going to get there. If anything, it's just an indication that you are in the game. If you're stuck right now, I'm there with you. But the way out is through the pivot. So pivot towards it. Pivot towards that next step, even if it's not what you had in mind. Pivot towards the anatomy of your dream. If there are any questions that you have, let me know down in the comments, because it might be your next episode. All right, guys, I will see you in the next one.